I'm just going to give you a quick um, uh, rundown on family history. I wasn't keen to do this, but then when I thought about it, I realised that in actual fact, um, our mum and dad died when we were relatively young, and we weren't really interested in family history at that stage. I mean, I would have been interested if we'd had a royal in the family, if I was going to be left with some castle or something, or if I'd had some uh, convict in the family, but I wasn't really interested in who was related to who, whatever. And of course, once your parents die, and once your grandparents and that are dead, you don't really have the opportunity. So it's good, I think, that Mark's doing this because it'll give you a little bit of an idea of family history. So starting with the Thomases, obviously I was a Thomas before I married, and Mark's covered John's side in his he covered his side the other night. So I'm just covering my side. Now the Thomases, an interesting history, I think, going back to about 1833, 34. They came from Cornwall, um, and they were, I think, my great grandfather, John Thomas. They all seemed to be John Thomases. The name was handed down. They didn't have much imagination. We probably had John Thomas Senior, John Thomas Junior, John Thomas. I think in America they have the first, the second. But anyway, so John Thomas was a engine driver, the initial John Thomas, or a miner. And tin mining was big in Cornwall. In fact, it was really such a big industry that this is a point of interest you may be interested to know, that in actual fact some of the tin mines still standing, the remnants of the tin mines still standing in Cornwall, are actually under UNESCO listing for World Heritage listing. So to put that in perspective, it's like being listed along with Machu Picchu and the pyramids and things like that, which is very curious. But anyway, so tin mining was huge. Tin mining, copper mining, and arsenic. And my great grandfather in 1833, just let me confirm that, John Thomas, no, sorry, in 1853, he actually died at the age of 33. And he was a miner, and he left a widow, Amelia Beaglehold, and Amelia Beaglehold was widowed in 1854, and she had four young sons. They had four young sons. John, who is my great-grandfather, he was 9 years old. There were twins, George and William, who were 8 years old, and a young fellow, James, who was 2. Now, Amelia Beaglehold must have been a very strong woman. I suppose she would have realised there was not much future. She couldn't go out and work, and it was customary in that era to send young children as young as 9 into the tin mines. And they were, because they were small, they were more agile, they were sent down into the mines. And the job primarily that the children did was to sweep up the arsenic from the flues. So it was obviously not a great future was in store for them. And she, very courageously, decided to come to Australia, and she'd heard about the mining and the gold mines and that in Australia, thought there would be a better future. And they came out on a ship called the Mermaid. So it would be in shipping records and everything in 1854 that she came very courageously to Australia with four young sons, one of whom was my great-grandfather. So when she actually they came to Bendigo where the mines where there was mining, and she actually did a year or so later marry a fellow called Joseph Carr in a Wesley chapel in Bendigo, because interestingly enough the Thomases were Methodist, or they were Methodist or Wesleyan, and the Catholicism, which is very strong and very important to our family, was introduced in the next generation. So she came out, she married. They had Joseph Carr and Amelia Beaglehold had another four sons. I think Amelia had had two daughters prior, but they had another four sons together, but all of whom died in infancy. I think the eldest one lived to 4 years. And the death rate amongst children was huge, absolutely huge in that era. So this woman, Amelia Beaglehold, who was my great-great-great-grandmother, took a very courageous step, brought these 4 young boys to Australia, and one of her sons, the eldest John, was my great-grandfather. So they settled in Bendigo. My great-grandfather, John Thomas, I don't know what his middle name was, John Thomas, he met and married a woman called Margaret O'Shaughnessy, who came from County Galway in Ireland. And this was when Catholicism came into the family. He became a Catholic, and the Thomases became very, very staunch Catholics. In that family, there was a bishop in my dad's family, so this is my dad's dad. When my dad, in his family, there was a bishop, there was a priest, there was a nun, there have been numerous vocations in the family. But Catholicism only came into the family with the marriage of my great-grandfather, John Thomas, to this Margaret O'Shaughnessy.
So she was from Ireland, was she?
She was from Galway in Ireland, yeah. So so we come to my great-grandfather. Now, if anybody's interested, you're probably not really that interested, other than that it's interesting that they were tin miners, that this was this woman, very strong woman who was widowed, and she would have only probably been in her 30s. He was only 33 when he died, that she took the step to bring these 4 little boys out to Australia. So that's of interest. Anybody who's interested further, I've got now when you come with a skip to get rid of all the rubbish that I have in the house, I do have a book that Denise very kindly gave me, I think in 1984. I haven't filled in much more history, but it's our family tree and album, so don't throw that out with all the other junk that you'll find in my house to put into that skip. But Denise, my sister Denise, who's in Bendigo, has researched really very widely the family history. So she's done it. Also a cousin, Maureen Thomas. I think Mark had some contact with her when he was going to Gulville and Cornwall. And also on the other side, the O'Connor side, which is my mum's side, I have a cousin, Bernadette Wells, and she lives at Merbeen, and she has researched that side of the family, mum's side of the family, very, very much. But getting back to Mark having contact with Maureen Thomas, I had said I wasn't really interested unless we had a convict, somebody interesting in the family. Well, I think Mark's disputing it now, but Mark went to Cornwall and to Gulville, and he was searching for John Thomas, who'd been a pirate. And Mark says now he possibly wasn't one of our relatives, but I'm claiming he's a relative because I think that's really exciting to have a pirate from Gulville. And that Gulville is now actually classed as a suburb of Penzance, and you've all heard of the Pirates of Penzance. So piracy was a big thing because this Penzance is on the faces the English Channel, so obviously they were either tin miners or they were pirates. But Mark actually did find this grave of this John Thomas. He was called John Eyebrows Thomas, and he was a pirate, and he was not permitted to be buried in his own community. He was actually buried at Gulville, and Mark did kind of go and find the grave of this John Eyebrows Thomas, and he has a skull and crossbones on his tombstone. And I think that he was probably I'm claiming him as a relative, but if you want to see the little clip Mark did, which was really quite interesting and funny, if you go to overlander.tv, you can see Mark searching for John Thomas, and he's in the cemetery attached to the church. They were all kind of attached to little churches, and he's found this tomb of John Thomas, and I'm claiming him as a... Anyway, so that was the Thomas side. Then John and Mary Shaughnessy had 8 children. Or did they have 7 children? They had 8 children, I think, and my dad was, just let me confirm that, they had, I've just got several children. One of whom was my grandfather, John Edward Thomas. Now, John Edward Thomas married a woman called Clara French. Now, I think her father came from Durham in England, but she came from County Clare in Ireland. And together they had 7 sons and 2 daughters. So that was, my dad was one of their sons. He was their second son. The eldest was Uncle Bert, and then there was my dad, another John Thomas. He was called Jack Leo Thomas. That was my dad. And then there was Father Frank, who became the bishop. He became the Bishop of Geraldton. And there was then, I think it was Uncle Vin and Auntie Kath, who were twins. So it's interesting because there were twins on the Thomas side and there's twins on the Shea side. So it wasn't really surprising that twins came up somewhere, in our family with Nicole and her twins. So Auntie Kath and Auntie Mary, who became a Mercy nun, they were twins. And then there was Father Basil, and who's the one I've missed? There were two girls, Sister Mary Antonia and Auntie Kath, and then there were the five boys, Uncle Bert, Dad, Uncle Vin, and Father Basil. Who was the other one? I've missed. Sorry, I've missed one of them. Who on earth was? Anyway, there were five boys and two girls. Who was it? Uncle Vin. Sorry, I've got to get this right. There was Uncle Bert, there was Dad, there was Father Frank. Yeah, there was Uncle Vin and Father Basil. Father Basil was another priest. He was a parish priest at Brighton, and he was in Bendigo. Both the brothers served as priests in Bendigo at some stage. And then Sister Mary Antonia was a Mercy nun. So that was my dad's family: 5 boys and 2 girls. Okay, now John Edward Thomas married Clara French, and I told you that was her father, I think, was from Durham in England, but her mother was from County Clare. So they married, and they had, as I said, my dad was one of their seven children, 5 sons and 2 daughters. I'll tell you a bit about my dad and mum. I'm just quickly going to cover the other side of the family in terms of the great-great-grandparents, okay? So mum was an O'Connor. Now, James Connor, I mean, the name's altered from time to time, James Connor or O'Connor, because you kids, your dad, it was a lot of the O'Sheas, it was O'Shea initially, and of course when they came to Australia they adopted Shea, and I think the ones who went to America kept the O. But anyway, so it was James Connor. As a young man, I think he was about 20, and it was probably about in the 1850s, he emigrated from Ballycapel, which is in the county of Tipperary in Ireland, and his parents were dead, and he had 2 younger brothers, Thomas and Michael. And this would have been in the era, and when I look at my O'Connor side, most of the ones who came from Ireland, it was in the era of the Great Famine, the potato famine, and that was about 1845 to 1849, and pretty well desecrated the population. I think over 1 million died of the plague, the blight, the potato blight. It was a disease that hit the potato crops, and over 1 million emigrated. And so the Irish were, and that side were farmers, tended to be farmers, whereas the Thomas side were miners. The O'Connor side tended to be farmers, and there were small tenant farmers that had, the landlords were English, and they leased a little plot of land to the Irish, and they found that potatoes were ideally suited to the soil, and they ate. The main diet was potatoes. That was pretty well the major diet of them. So when the potato famine hit, it was caused absolute, almost annihilation of them, and they were either immigrated or died. And I'm presuming that, I think, and I can't confirm this, and Denise could confirm, but I think that this James Connor who came out, I think there's no mention of his parents, so I think he and his 2 younger brothers, the parents had died probably from the potato famine because it absolutely desecrated. And a level of antagonism exists between the Irish and the British today for many reasons. One of them was the way that the British handled the potato famine and the aftermath of that. And so all these people immigrated to Australia, and I presume that the wife he met, Mary Sheehan, she came from Ireland too, and her parents, it would have been the same story. They would have immigrated for because they either stay there and die of starvation, as millions did, or to immigrate. So they came to Australia. Now this James, he worked long enough to earn enough money to sponsor his 2 younger brothers, who were Thomas and Michael. And in about 1854, they came to Sydney on the boat called the Rodney. You'd be able to look at the passenger list on that and find these brothers. And he sponsored them as assisted immigrants to Australia. Now, about 6 months afterwards, they arrived in Sydney, obviously, and about 6 months later, they actually walked. The three brothers walked to Melbourne, and they then went to the goldfields in Bendigo, around Bendigo, and Fryers Creek. In 1962, James married this Mary Sheehan, and they moved to Heskett, where my mum was pretty well raised. That was the farmhouse that we remembered. It was called Brooklyn Place. I don't know where Brooklyn Place comes from, but they actually purchased land. They came first settlers on a farm in Heskett. They bought land from the government and they settled there. And Denise tells me that the name Brooklyn Place is still on the property, which of course has left the family, the O'Connor family, years ago. But Brooklyn Place has still been, it's replaced the name place on that farm. So Michael moved to the farm with James and his wife. Thomas stayed at the goldfields in Bendigo. James later on, Michael later on bought a property at Hanging Rock, which is in the area. James had 8 children. James and Mary had 8 children. And Daniel, he was the 6th child. That's my grandfather, Daniel. So Daniel O'Connor was the 6th child. Uncle Jim, I remember well too. He was the 5th child. So we knew grandfather Daniel O'Connor and Uncle Jim. And they actually owned some of the first cars, the Ford model. Was it the Ford T model or whatever? Andrew will know because he's interested in cars. One of the first cars. I think grandfather's was a 4-seater, and I think Uncle Jim's was a 2-seater. And one thing I remember about grandfather O'Connor, he used to do this awful thing that I still shudder. He would pretend he had the O'Connor nose, which I suppose was a bit like a Roman nose, we'd say. And he used to grab it and he'd pretend that he was twisting his nose and he'd be grinding his back teeth. And when I was a kid, it was like chalk, on a chalkboard or something, or your fingernails on a chalkboard. This horrible thing, he'd grab his nose and he'd twist it and he'd be grinding his teeth, and I thought that he was really actually twisting his nose and the bones were... That's the one thing I remember about grandfather O'Connor, and the car, and Uncle Jim. So he was the 6th of this James Connors who came out during the potato famine. Okay, so that takes care of that. And anybody who's interested in researching it any further, if you ever get to that stage where you're interested in family history and ancestry, as I said, Denise would be the one to contact, and or Maureen Thomas, and or on Mum's side, Bernadette Wells. So now to get to my dad and Mum. So Daniel O'Connor married interestingly enough, a girl, an Eliza Jane Maguire. Her father, Dennis Maguire, he was actually a gardener, and it's understood that he actually worked on the botanical gardens in Melbourne, and assisted in the design of the botanical gardens in Melbourne, which is an interesting fact. Eliza Jane O'Connor, my grandma, she had a wonderful voice, soprano voice, and she sang at weddings, and she was also a great violinist. So the musical side of the family, I guess, comes probably from the O'Connors. I have heard the Shays sing, and I can assure you it doesn't come from... Well, no, that's not right, because actually Jerry and Cheryl's, a couple of their kids are quite musically talented, but let's say it doesn't come from John. Sorry. Your dad. Sorry. But anyway, so I'm claiming that it probably comes from... But that's just me being a bit facetious, okay? Anyway, so my dad had, as I said, 4 brothers and 2 sisters. Their Bendigo was where they were, and Dad's grandfather O'Connor was also in the mines. He was an engine driver, I think, in the mines, and he later on worked as a boiler in the boilers. Or so. He was an engine driver of the gold mines and then a boiler attendant at the St Aidan's Orphanage Laundry, which is still there, St Aidan's, that building where it was. He married, I told you he married Clara Ann French. Okay, so Daniel O'Connor. Daniel O'Connor married Liza Maguire. Okay, they're my grandparents. They had 4 girls and 1 son. So that was Molly. Some of you will remember Molly O'Connor. And then they had, next was Mum. She was Cecily O'Connor. And then there was Veronica O'Connor. Now, Veronica, she was very artistic. She held her own art exhibitions. I've got a painting in the hallway of Veronica's. And she was probably a forerunner of her time because everybody travels overseas now, but Veronica actually travelled quite widely, as a back in that era. Actually, a funny story, apparently she was on a ferry or something, or a ship or something in one of the Scandinavian countries, and somebody heard her Australian accent and said very excitedly, "Oh, I know somebody who lives in Australia." I mean, seriously, I know somebody who lives in Australia. But the funny thing was, the person they mentioned actually lived in the same block of flats in East Melbourne as Veronica. What are the chances? As Veronica lived. One person, they knew one person in Australia and happened to live in the same block of flats in East Melbourne that Veronica lived in. But Veronica actually died about 2 weeks before Mum. And she actually, when she was in her late 20s, she was engaged to a fellow who died on the operating theatre. I think he was having heart surgery or something. He died on the operating theatre. And she literally went white, or so we're told. She went white overnight. She had very white hair. And as long as we knew her, she had white hair. We used to call her the rich aunt because she'd travel to the Isle of Capri and she'd travel overseas and she'd bring us back little gifts. Anne-Marie and I still recall these little straw hats we had that she'd brought back for us from the Isle of Capri. So Veronica, so there was Molly, which you older kids would remember Molly. There was Mum, there was Veronica, then there was Tom. He was the only boy, and Tom was the one who, after the family moved into Woodend from Heskett, which is about 10 k's apart, moved from the farm. Tom actually lived at the farm at Heskett, and it's his daughter Bernadette Wells who's researched the O'Connor side very. He got into quite detail, and then there was Doreen was the youngest. Okay, so that was dad's siblings and mum's siblings. Okay, now I'll get to mum and dad. Okay, so, which unfortunately none of you kids knew, mum or dad. Mark was, Nicole had just been born. She was born on the 21st of June and Dad 72, and Dad died on the 28th of August 72. Mum died in 1966, so you didn't know any of them. Now, Mum was a very people still remember Mum. She was had a very peaceful aura about her. She was a very gentle lady, and she'd probably be a bit shocked at my raucousness. And when Anne-Marie and Joe and I get together, we could be very, very raucous and very loud. Mum was always very gently spoken. A real lady. She had a certain charisma about her. There's only 2 other people I recall who had that same aura about them. And one was a nun, or both of them were nuns actually. One was Sister Gerardus. I remember she had that very gentle, something special about them. So Mum was very highly thought of. She was a primary school teacher, and she met Dad. So Catholicism, as I said, was a huge thing. They were very, very, very Catholic, her side and Dad's side. To the extent, mind you, I'll just add this in, when Mum was expecting a baby, or before she was expecting a baby, after she married Dad, her maternal grandma, that was her mum, and my maternal grandma, that was her mum, and Dad's mum, both prayed that she'd have a baby boy and that he would be a priest. And lo and behold, she had a baby boy, and he's Father Hugh. So it was loaded against him. He didn't have a chance. He was destined to be a priest. Mind you, it's always what he aspired to be, and he's never regretted it for one day in his life. He's the most joyous. He's got, if you were to find one word to describe Hugh, it would be joyful. He's very joyful in his vocation and everything. So, but that's interesting that Grandma Thomas and Grandma O'Connor and Grand Thomas both prayed that Mum would have a baby boy, that he'd be a priest. Anyway, getting back to Mum, when she was looking for board, she went to Bendigo Teachers College, she was looking for board, and they were looking for a good Catholic family where she could board. And they went to Bendigo looking for somewhere, and they found Dad's mother's house, Dad's mum and dad. That was John Edward and Clara were living at Bendigo. It was 100, I don't know where they lived prior to 116 Mackenzie Street, but that's where I knew them when I was a kid. And they saw the name Lesieur on the when they were waiting at the front door to inquire about the private board there. They saw the name Lesieur. Well, that's associated with the great Saint Therese of Lisieux, or the Little Flower. So they immediately thought, oh, this is going to be a good Catholic home. So Mum boarded there, and she became great friends with Dad's Sister Mary Antonia, who was Mary at the time. And she met Dad, and they were kind of friends, but Dad was kind of going off overseas on exchange to teach in England. And it was several years before he did travel fairly widely. He went to Egypt. I think Anne-Marie's got a fire screen that's got a tapestry of the pyramids, and and he came back with a pith helmet, I remember, and different artefacts from his travels in Egypt and that. And so it was a few years later, I think Dad was 35 and Mum was 33 before they actually married. But they did marry, and getting back to Mum, she'd done a teacher training, and she actually had been raised at Heskett at this the farm, and she actually talking about they used to travel. It's 10 k's I think in a horse and buggy into church. Then you had to fast in that area. You had to fast between midnight and till you received communion. So they'd fast from midnight the day before. They'd come in a horse and buggy into church, and then they'd return home, and they'd finally, get to eat and drink something, probably about 12 hours later. So, but Mum used to ride a horse into school. She rode a horse into the school at Heskett. And she used to go to ball dances, and she said that balls were kind of the big, I think they were probably the social event. They'd have regular balls in these country areas, and I presume it was Ball and Wood End, because she used to pack up her evening gown. Of course, they wore gloves and the whole bit in that era. They really dolled up for the balls. And she'd pack her evening gown, her gloves and her shoes and that in a saddlebag, I suppose. She'd ride her horse into the dance hall. She'd get into a finery, and then she'd change back into a horse gear, and she'd ride back home. And I can remember at Irene's funeral, I think it was Bernadette or one of my cousins told me that Tom was Mum's only brother, and he married a woman, Irene Barker, and I think Tom was about 10 years older than Irene, but anyway, Irene was married when she was only about 19, I think. And but Tom used to dink her on a bike in her evening gown and gloves and all. Used to dink her several kilometres into the ball when they'd be going to the ball. He'd dink her on the bar of his bike into the balls. So a completely different era, which we don't even know, and certainly the grandkids, it's quite foreign to anything that you kids know. As I said, Grandfather O'Connor and Uncle Jim probably had some of the first cars, but it was horseback. They rode horse and buggy to school, they rode horses, so it was a different era. But to get to Mum and her teaching, well, she had there's an interesting story about Mum. She taught as a very young teacher, she taught up at a place called Canny, which is up near, I think, Sea Lake, Lake Boga, that area. It's in the Mallee. And they had a mice plague, and apparently the wheat stack sheaths were only about 60 yards from the school, and the mice absolutely overran the school and ate all through all the books. Used to drink the ink from the inkwells and left the school in disarray. Actually, there were Mum had written as a young teacher, written to the education department, and the language they used, it was rather funny, very formal type of language that she used in this letter, requesting that I have the honour of applying to you for assistance with, and she was asking if the education department, if they could send some big tin chests or whatever so they could store the school records. Most of the stuff they'd stored in kerosene tins and cream cans and that to prevent the mice from getting to them, but there were some of the bigger records which they couldn't fit into them, so she was requesting that they give them these. Anyway, she was knocked back. She was told that there were several other schools in the area that were affected in the same way, and that she just needed to line the cupboards with tin or whatever, but she didn't get a great response from them. But apparently, in the morning they'd go in and there might be, the kids must have had a wonderful time. They'd all have sticks, and one occasion they caught 230 mice, clubbed 230 mice, obviously with these sticks, but they'd have to wash all the desks with phenol, they'd have to clean out the holes, so this was a real, and it was hazardous to their health. I think Mum in the letter mentioned that it might be a good idea to close the school and to send the teacher away for 3 months or whatever, because she felt it was detrimental to their health. It was. But anyway, she didn't get a response, so she was obviously stuck there. But Anne-Marie and Joe, I think, both have copies of this letter that Mum had written, this little place in Canny. And interestingly enough, when I started teaching up at Ararat West, when I came back to Ararat and was married, the principal there was a fellow called John Collins, and Mum had actually taught him as a prep at Canny, which was a very interesting connection. So I got to meet him later on. But so Mum, that was her experience. Dad, he was also a teacher. He taught at Brunswick Tech, and I think he taught at Footscray Tech, and I think it was maybe it was Footscray Tech where he had actually had. We thought it was Squizzy Taylor. Anybody who's watched what was that show, that mafia show on television? What was it called? There was a series, Underbelly. You've seen Underbelly. Squizzy Taylor was one of the big names in that. Well, Dad had actually taught Squizzy Taylor's. We thought it was Squizzy Taylor, but it was Squizzy Taylor's girlfriend, and apparently she was a brassy young thing who I think Dad, as a young male teacher, probably found a bit intimidating. That's my spin on it, whether it's right or not. I don't know. Dad's not here to dispute it. But anyway, so Dad, but another interesting thing, Dad was very keen on sport. And he was actually, when he was at Brunswick Tech, he was a sports master, and he actually coached Neil Harvey, who I think he was in the Australian cricket team. I think he played in 79 tests, and I think he was vice captain between 63 and 70 something or other. But he played in 79 tests for Australia. Neil Harvey, if anybody's interested in cricket. There were 2 other brothers, I think, Merv and Mick, but they didn't reach the same heights that Neil Harvey did. And also, so Dad was very interested in sport. He used to train, was to our delight, to my sister's delight, when we lived in Ararat. He would sometimes have some of the boys from the school who would come round and train in the backyard. We used to, of course, we weren't allowed to be down there standing on the sidelines, but we used to be in the other section of the yard making eyes at the boys. And Dad was teaching them, he was right up with he was teaching them the Fosbury flop, which was, there was an American athlete called Dick Fosbury, I think, who won the gold medal in the 1968 Summer Olympics. And the Fosbury flop, he was ridiculed for it initially, but it was what you see all high jumpers do now, going over the bar back first, kind of going over the back first. So Dad, Joe remembers him showing these boys how to do the Fosbury flop, but he used to train them in that. He was always keen on the sports, and he used to. I think one of the fellows ran at Stall Gift, one of the ones that he had an interest in and was training. But his real forte was English. He was into debating and very good at debating. And Jota, it's interesting now. You know, if Mark had been wise, I think Mark probably thinks that John and I might die before he gets back from overseas because he was really anxious to do this before he headed off. Now, he must think we're going to die, we're not going to be here to tell the story. As I said, I'm glad in a way I can give you a brief thing about the family history, and if you're interested, you know where to research it, because as I said, we left it too late, and all our memories differ a bit. Like Anne-Marie, Joe and Denise and I would probably all have slightly different memories, and Hugh. But Joe says that, where was that leading? Oh, that's right. What I was going to say was, there you go, perfect example of my memory. Mark would have been wiser to have left this interview for a few more years because I'm losing my memory. But I believe when you get Alzheimer's and dementia, you have a really, really good long-term memory. Short-term memory is shot, but you can remember things that happened 50, 60, 70 years very, very, very well. So, you know, probably if you wanted to get a really accurate idea, you should have left this interview for a bit longer till I'd really lost it. But anyway, Joe and I, Anne-Marie and Denise, vary a bit in our memories. But Joe said, and I do remember there used to be down by the Yarra River, they used to have soap boxes, often on a Sunday morning, or they people would get up there with different political views or different agendas, and they'd stand the soapbox. I suppose that's where the origin came from. You'd stand on your soapbox and you'd have your opinion. And Dad, I think, used to go down sometimes, according to Mary Jo, and from the peanut gallery, he used to debate, or he used to have his opinion on, or sometimes call to question some of the things that some of these soapboxes people on the soapbox were saying. Dad was he was in debating team, and he was in the same group as Frank McManus, who became, I think he was the first leader of the DLP when the DLP split from the Labor Party because the Labor Party was, there was too much communist influence in the unions and that. So the ALP, Dad used to vote ALP, and then the ALP split and became the Democratic Labor Party, and you had people like Bob Santa Maria and Frank McManus. Well, Dad was, one up with Frank McManus, and then I think you had Cornwall and Everett and those who retained connection with the Labor Party, the ALP. But anyway, that's just by the by. But Dad was into debating. He was a big member of the CYMS, was it Catholic Young Men's Society. And I think Hugh said he used to have a lot of their they used to put out magazines, and Dad was always being mentioned in this or that. He was, as I said, he was a great debater. He travelled, before he met Mum, he travelled overseas, and he did a stint in, he got some glowing references. Joe and Anne-Marie have copies of, and Denise, I think, have copies of some of the references. Dad was very, very highly thought of as a teacher. He was very, very highly respected and very highly thought of, and he's got a couple of references from former principals. He came to Ararat from Warwick Nabil. He used to ride his bike up and down to the school at Warwick Nabil, and when he came to Ararat, he was the senior master, didn't want to be the principal, he didn't want that responsibility. He was a senior master in the disciplinarian, and I know he used to tell us that the kids would be sent to his office, and he'd actually smoked heavily because smoking wasn't known to be harmful, and Dad did die of emphysema, but it wasn't, everybody smoked in that era, and it was widely promoted. You had everybody, actors and the Marlboro Man and all the ads and that, and nobody knew how harm. Dad used to grow his own tobacco leaves and hang them in the shed at Warwick Nabil. We used to have the tobacco leaves growing and hanging on the shed, and he used to roll his cigarettes. And but anyway, what was I going to say? See my memory. Oh, that's right. When he travelled, apparently Hugh told me that he used to, he'd travel, it's during school holidays and time off, he'd travel to the continent from England where he was teaching, and he used to eat a lot of garlic because he said the only way to combat on the continent, everybody ate garlic, or they stank of garlic. The Italians, sorry to any Italians who are listening. And so the only way to counteract it was to eat garlic himself. So he used to eat a lot of garlic. But Dad was that generation was, he was a very loving father, but not demonstrative in any shape or form because they weren't in that era. And even I think probably you kids would say that John was never, never one to kiss or hug. Or even I wasn't really demonstrative, not the way young parents are nowadays. When I see Andrew with his kids and all the rest of that, I think it was a different era. But then Dad was very, but I can remember always never quite going to approach Dad about things. We'd kind of go to Mum and say, Mum, would you ask Dad if we could do this or if we can go here or whatever. But I can always remember the one, we didn't have sweets and lollies and things the way that kids do nowadays. Our one treat used to be every payday, which was every second Thursday, Dad would buy a 2-shilling bag of boiled lollies. And he'd bring it home and we'd all just be hanging out for these boiled lollies. That was our treat. That was the one treat. We never had ice creams or drinks or anything like that. I can remember when you went, Mark, to Port Fairy or somewhere with Margot Kyatt and Michael Kyatt. You were taken to Port Fairy once. And Margot, you'd never had a milkshake. And Margot was astonished you'd never had a milkshake. I'd never had a milkshake until I was about, I think, a former boyfriend of Anne-Marie's. Sorry, Kevin. And shouted her, and I was the tag-along younger sister, a spider. And he shouted me one. That was my first lime spider, and I think it was a few years later before I had a milkshake, and I would have been probably in my 20s. So it was a different era. And as a kid, certainly I can remember we didn't have a fridge, we had a Coolgardie safe. And that was just a Hessian cage thing. It had Hessian sides, just had 4 bits of wood, and it was on 4 legs, and it just had Hessian sides, and you had the water dripping down the sides, and that would keep all your things. That acted as a fridge, and then we graduated to an ice box. That was a real step up. You had the ice box, and you had the block of ice sitting. The iceman used to deliver the block of ice, and you'd have that sitting on top of the ice chest, and that was where we kept our things cold. And I can remember the old Hessian bag that we drank from. We had our water in that, and to keep the water cool, because we lived in most of my childhood. I was born in Wangaratta. When I was 5 months old, we moved to Warwick-Nabeal, so I spent all my primary schooling in Warwick-Nabeal. So I have memories of being in Warwick-Nabeal, and I can remember the Hessian bags. And Mum, we had a wonderful vegetable garden. Dad grew the vegetables. He grew the carrots and the potatoes and things. Mum had the fruit trees. We had, Hugh tells me we had 13 peach trees, and we had 2 apricot trees. We had a pomegranate tree, and we had a plum tree. And we used to have chooks in the backyard, and so we were pretty well self-sufficient really in terms of growing our own food and that. And Mum there was always stewed fruit. Mum would have the big preserving jars, and she used to boil up the fruit in the copper. We had a laundry which was kind of outside the back door. The laundry was to the side, and we had a washing machine. You'd have a hand wringer that you'd put the sheets in and put them through. You'd boil them up, the copper up, and do the hand washing. So this is all in my childhood, in my memory. I remember all this. The heating up the trough and the water, and Mum used to wash it all. Then you'd have to put it through the wringer, and so that's all in my memory. And in the bathroom, we used to have a bath once a week. Sorry. But it was an old kindling. You had the water thing, and you'd light the little fire under it with little kindling. You used to heat up the water, and then the bath would be filled, and we'd probably all get the same. Youngest one always got off the worst because they always got the dirty water at the end of the bath. But at least I think we had a bath once, and a clean once a week. Whereas I think if you lived back in the 18th century or somewhere, you maybe didn't get one at all. But anyway, so that's in my memory. I can remember incidents when I was a kid. I remember one incident where I had the kids lived across the road. Jeannie Higginbotham and Donnie Higginbotham were a girl and a boy we were friends with. They lived across the road, and Donnie apparently had a broken arm. I didn't know his arm was broken, but I must have had an argument with him and I hit him on his arm. And I remember his mother, Gracie Higginbotham, chasing me. I must have been about 9 or something. Round our veggie garden, in and out the veggie garden, saying, you ought to say your prayers, you're going to go to hell, you should say your prayers. And I ran in between the tank stand. We had a tank stand, and you had to be a skinny little kid of about 9, skinny little kid to be able to squeeze in between. And I can remember hiding there for hours till I thought it was safe to come out. But when we were kids, we used to have concerts in the shed, and Hugh used to celebrate a fake mass. And he was a forerunner of the girl altar service, because we used to have Anne-Marie and Joe and I would all be the altar servers. We'd be the girl altar servers. I think we'd have cordial and bread and that. We'd pretend to be having the mass. So that was... And Hugh, interesting enough, when he was a boy, he was in Warrnambool, and he used to follow he worked at a cafe cafe, selling soft drinks, and then he used to do liveries on his bike, and he used to ride. He followed the football up the Wimmera, and he'd go to all the matches. He didn't go from Warrnambool, he didn't go to Ararat because that was too far afield, but he used to ride. He had one of his mates was Kevin Kelly, a fella called Kevin Kelly, who lived about 14 k's out on a farm, and Hugh would ride every Saturday. He'd ride 7 miles on his bike, and Kevin Kelly would ride 7 miles and meet him. Then they'd ride back to the family farm, which was 14 miles away, and then they'd go with the parents to the football match, wherever it was, and followed it round. And he used to sell the Wimmera Record, which is the equivalent of that, football thing that they put out, and with the teams and the players and all the rest of that out. He used to sell that to get a bit of pocket money too. So, so he used to ride his bike to, all around the country to follow the football. So that's Hugh. Anne-Marie, well, what about Anne-Marie? Well, Anne-Marie, I have to say, I probably owe my life to Anne-Marie, because I went through a really, really difficult time a few years ago, and it was only through her support and concern and persistence that I really got through it. I was kind of really, really low over a different matter, and and she got me through it. So I'm always grateful to Anne-Marie. I feel very grateful to her, and of course Mary Jo. Well, Jo. Well, what can I say about Jo? I have got a story, but I'm not allowed to tell her. And Denise, we used to have 2 highlights when we were kids, and I recall we didn't. Dad had a bike, so we didn't have cars or anything. We used to have we'd take it in turns to perhaps go to the farm at Heskett for a holiday with Mum. So I have very happy memories of holidays at Heskett with our Aunt Irene and Tom and their family, and Margaret, Rosemary, Bernadette, Dennis and Tricia were all comparable to our ages, and we used to have some wonderful times there. I still remember Irene's cherry pies and cream, delicious, and shortbread and that. But and riding the horse and being through the barn and being stranded, grabbing onto the rafters and being left, the horse going out from under me and I'm left hanging, and I remember incidences like that. And we had wonderful times. But apart from that, we didn't travel out of Warrnambool. We had 10-week school holidays in that area. You had 3 terms. It was nothing to get a succession of hot days, over 100, in Warrnambool. The seasons have changed dramatically, because even when you kids were older, Mark and Nicole and Paul, I can remember you coming home at the end of October, November, and asking if you could go to the swimming pool, the Olympic pool. So it would be hot enough to do that, whereas now it doesn't warm up until January, February here. But and you have the 4 terms. But we spent our lives at the Yarriambiack Creek. I nearly drowned in the Yarriambiack Creek. I had to be pulled out in the creek. That was where I learned to swim, and I kind of was testing myself one day and seeing how many breaths. I never did the breathing properly. I'd just kind of hold my breath and go for it. And I think I was trying to see how many I could do before I had to have a breath. And instead of going parallel to the shore, I was actually going out into the deep. And I was really testing myself, and I went as hard as I could. I stood up. I didn't have an ounce of breath left in me. Went to put my feet down because I was in the middle of the creek and couldn't stand up, and I had to virtually be pulled out. Joe remembers. Joe thinks that Dad taught. I don't remember Dad teaching us swimming, but he did teach swimming in that, and apparently, so Joe tells me. I don't remember that. She remembers being dinked on his bike down to Yarriamback Creek, and Dad was a whistler, and I love men who whistle, and it's a dying art. People don't whistle now. Dad used to whistle around the place, and Jo said she remembers him being dinked down, feeling so special. It was her turn to go down to the Yarriamback Creek with Dad, being dinked on the bike and to be whistling kind of under his breath. I can actually kind of whistle in a fashion, but I do look like a monkey, but my whistle goes something like... I can't really do it in public because I do look like a monkey when I do it. Anyway, I'm being ridiculous. But yeah, so Dad was a handyman. He was a brilliant teacher. He was well loved by his students. He was a disciplinarian, but he used to do a nasty trick on them. He actually gave up smoking years before he died, but it was too late. The damage was done to the lungs. But he always sucked barley sugars. He never lost the craving for nicotine. So apparently it's a stronger addiction than marijuana or other drugs. It's harder to give up. People give it up numerous times, and then they go back on it. But anyway, he used to have barley sugar, and kids would be sent to this when he was a disciplinarian, the senior master at Arrowhead High School, for discipline if they'd done something. And more often than not, they'd come out sucking on a barley sugar and just being told not to do it again or not to do it again. But sometimes he would be a bit mean, and he'd get the strap. He told us he used to get the strap, and he'd bang it down on the desk, and the kids standing outside waiting for his turn to go in would be petrified. He'd got his punishment, sweating in waiting to get in to see Mr. Thomas. And Dad, of course, was just... so he'd go in and the kid would come out in the end with the barley sugar or something. And Dad, I can remember Dad telling us he could never work out, because smoking was a big thing, and the kids would sneak down behind the shelter sheds at the school, and Dad said he'd go down there and he'd see the smoke rising, but he could never find where the cigarettes were on them. And one of I think it was Les Ralph, who actually bought our old home in Rundle Street, and some of the others told us, I think Murray, what's his name? Who was that? He was a publican up at the Shire Hall. He also said they used to put them... You can pull a biro apart and pull out the ink part of it, and they used to put the cigarettes in there, because the kids used to wear their pens in their shirt tops. So that's where they hid them, and they said Dad never did wake up to where they were hidden. But I think he was smarter than that. He probably didn't know, I think. But anyway, so Dad was a bit of a handyman. He kind of built a whole section. I presumed all men were handymen.